high literary books, something that you couldn't see in like a New York Times or a paper, even at that time, simply because they had to like sort of allow for the more popular, the more like wide reaching sort of books that they'd also want to cover. And this was able to be just focused on like high literary stuff, weird stuff, international stuff. And the book review editor, Greg Howard, asked me if I'd review this because he knew that he'd heard me talking about Act of the Damned. I was like big fan. And so I read it and immediately freaked out because I had never reviewed a book before and was like, this book I don't understand at all.
Hello, welcome to the Big Book Project. I'm Lori Feathers, and today I'm so pleased to have with me Chad W. Post. Chad, welcome.
Thanks for having me. I love that you include the W.
I think you're pretty particular about the W, so I wanted to include it. So Chad is the editorial director of Dalkey Archive Press and the publisher of Open Letter Books. And today we are here to talk about the work of António Lobo Antunes, and he's published by Dalkey Archive Press, most recently the novel Midnight is Not in Everyone's Reach, which we'll be talking about, but we're also going to talk about his body of work, and to the extent that I know it, you know it much better than I do, Chad. But why don't you start out by telling us like how you got to know this author and his books?
Are you prepared for me to monologue for a little bit here?
You go.
I do. I have a story for you. Okay. So António Lobo Antunes was initially published by Grove Press back in like the late 90s, early 2000s. And there were a series of books that they published by him that all had like these kind of matching designs. Like this is one of them, is the Natural Order of Things. They have a very specific sort of like graphic component that looks kind of similar. Now, when I first got to Dalkey Archive in the year 2000, I believe there's only one of his books that they had on the shelves at that time, which was Act of the Damned. And I saw the cover of it, thought that it looked super cool. I was very much into like Latin American, Spanish literature, and Portuguese seems about right. Yeah, this came out in 93. And so I picked it up and started reading it and was absolutely floored. It was like, immediately I was like, this is my guy. This is someone who's doing something that's like stylistically reminiscent of Faulkner, has like a real big social basis, is like international in its concerns, and in the way that at the time, like even now, and we can get into this later, but like even now when he talks about like the history of Portugal and its relationship to like both the like 74 revolution, but then Angola as well, a lot of that was like well beyond my knowledge. So reading it was like kind of that thrill, especially at that time when you're like in your 20s, where it's like, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to suss out what's going on here. And it was like super cool. And Act of the Damned was very funny. Like it had this sort of humor that's in that kind of Faulkner vein where like things are going along. People are very stressed out. Revolution is happening. The haves and the have-nots are like, the haves are trying to protect themselves from the have-nots, to put it simply. And this doctor is sort of involved with the family like that. And it all feels very dramatic. And then when you pull back, you're like, this is really funny. Like as like a set piece, this is funny. The situation is kind of funny. Everyone's like reacting in ways that are like extreme and a little intense. And I thought it was just like the best voice, the best sort of like, it was what I liked, exactly what I liked. So shortly thereafter, it was let me make sure I'm right. It was The Return of the Caravels, this book that came out in hardcover from Grove while I was working at Dalkey. And at Dalkey at the time, there was the Review of Contemporary Fiction, which is the literary journal that was come out 3 times a year, have some like interesting, like more academic pieces about particular authors, sometimes a long overview, sometimes little different essays, and then a really extensive book review section, which at the time, and I'd still like, when I go back and look at them, those book review sections are amazing. All like short capsule reviews of like 250, 350 words maximum. But covering like really like high literary books, something that you couldn't see in like a New York Times or a paper, even at that time, simply because they had to like sort of allow for the more popular, the more like wide reaching sort of books that they'd also want to cover. And this was able to be just focused on like high literary stuff, weird stuff, international stuff. And the book review editor, Greg Howard, asked me if I'd review this because he knew that he'd heard me talking about Act of the Damned. I was like, big fan. And so I read it and immediately freaked out because I had never reviewed a book before and was like, this book I don't understand at all. I don't know what's going on. There's this war I don't know anything about. I'm like trying to piece it together. I read it a second time and was like, oh, okay, I get enough to be able to write about this. So I wrote a book review. And as it turns out, this became the very first time that my name was ever in a book, because they quoted my review extensively on the front page of the paperback version. And I'm above certain people like the New York Times, George Steiner, Vogue. I'm like rank higher. I take up more space than a lot of them. It's very funny. And I remember like that happening and just being like, this is the most amazing experience of my life. I will never reach these pinnacles again. And immediately then just started buying everything. So I will show for the visual element of this that what I have before me are every single, I can't hold them all at once. So these are all is one set of them. And this is the other set of them. And I believe with one exception, well, two exceptions, every single book of hers that's translated into English. There's one that was retranslated, I believe is Knowledge of Hell, though I should have double checked this to make sure. But I believe his Knowledge of Hell was originally translated as like South of Nowhere. And that was like very, very, very long time ago. And when it was reissued, it was retranslated at the same time. And then the book that we're talking about, Midnight is Not in Everyone's Reach, I edited, worked on, and do not have a physical copy of. I will not get that for I don't know how long because of the way that Deep Vellum / Dalkey mails out review copies. So I'm missing those two, but otherwise I have everything. And I've read everything except for the two most recent ones from Yale, which are these two. Until Stones Become Lighter Than Water and By the Rivers of Babylon. So that's like a little bit of an intro, but I do want to segue into saying one other thing about this is that because I was such a super fan at Dalkey, and there were these, I think it's 6 books from Grove plus one from Norton that had come out at that time. They're all matching. And I was such a huge fan. And we had at that time an intern who was from Brazil. And so I figured, I talked to Morgan Entrekin. He's like, oh, those books don't sell very well. They only sell like 6,000 copies a piece. And I was like, 6,000 my ass. Like there's not a chance that one of these books sold 6,000 copies. But he was like, kind of like clear that he wasn't interested in doing him anymore, that Antunes wasn't big enough. He didn't win the Nobel Prize. Saramago won at that time. That seemed like, it'll be, 20 years until Portugal can win again. Granted, now it's 20 years later. Antunes could win the Nobel Prize. That would be great. But at the time, it was kind of like, well, if he had won, great, but he didn't. So books are what they are. So they were going to leave him be. And so our Brazilian intern that was at Dalkey at the time, I convinced her to start reading his books. And so she went through and did readers' reports on 6 of them. Now, I'm unclear in my memory which 6 those were exactly, but I believe, there's one other book that I don't have here, which is What Can I Do When Everything's on Fire? And there's a essay collection. Those are at my other office, so I don't have those. But she started doing reviews on like some of the ones that have come out since then, but also like ones that still have not been translated. The Death of Carlos Gardel, for instance. But she was the reason that because of her readers' reports that I convinced John O'Brien that we should do a number of books of his. So they signed on a set of like 4 for Dalkey at that time, which included Knowledge of Hell, which included The Splendor of Portugal, which is another huge one, and may even have included the more recent ones because there's like a secondary set of contracts, but it kind of overlaps. So John was committed to doing a number of these and to doing a bunch of them as quickly as possible. It took ages for these to come out, both because like of their internal like publishing issues, but they're also such, as you know, like incredibly difficult books. They've been translated by everyone from like Susanne Levine, Elizabeth Lowe did the most recent one. There are a couple other translators that have been involved, Margaret Jill Costa being one, and then the translator of Waiting for the Crocodiles is Karen Sherwood Sotolino. So a few people have worked on him. I think all of them are like incredibly, talented translators, but run into the same problem of like, this is a very complex set of prose to work with, given the fact that Antunes writes in like multiple voices almost within the same paragraph and multiple time shifts within the same page, frequently like mixing like memories that are kind of true or like reconstructed memories with something that's happening in the current moment with like perspectives on those moments. So like trying to just separate out how you like what's going on is complex for like a reader, and for a translator it feels like overwhelming, and to be able to get it just right is so critical, because the second that it's like off, it all starts to fall into like a murky miasma of like, I don't have anything to grab onto as a reader. So it's taken them quite some time to translate the books, but also they are huge, they're complex, and Dalkey wasn't bringing them out super fast. So we do have it all straightened away, and there's one more to come after this. But overall, like, he's always been one of my favorites, with the one exception that like, or the one caveat that I don't read all of his books as soon as they come out usually, because when I think of reading them, I'm like, this is going to be heavy. This is going to be depressing. This is going to be a lot of work. This is going to be an undertaking, and I have to be in the right mindset to like go into that. So like during the winter, I'm always like, should I read this? And I'm like, I don't know if it's a good idea. I think this might be a problem.
Well, I've in preparing for this, in addition to Midnight is Not in Everyone's Reach, I read parts of the Splendor of Portugal and parts of the Inquisitor's Manual, and the commonality that I see, apart from the polyvocalism of it, is there's always the dad is always a drunk. That seems to be like a common theme.
That I wonder how true that is across all literature of a certain period.
Yeah, really. It's got to be pretty prevalent, like in other places as well. But that was
reading a lot of these Irish books, like
yeah. I know that you've been recording your program, Mining the Dalkey Archive, on the Irish books. So yeah, I think it's kind of fascinating that that there's been not so many publishers, because that kind of makes sense. And I mean, the publishing, it's been like a period of like 30 years, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But that there's been so many translators. And so one of the things that I was wondering, well, first of all, if you've got another one that's in the pipeline for Dalkey Archive, will that be translated by Elizabeth Lowe, who also did Midnight is Not in Everyone's Reach? Okay.
Yeah, she did that and Commission of Tears. And then this third one, which at the moment is untitled, like, and that's why when I look back at like which ones the Brazilian student may have done the readers reports on, it's a little confusing because the titles shift a lot between the original and the finished version. I think Midnight is Not in Everyone's Reach is sort of close to the original, but like it might not be. I think it's like 3 something. Like there's a few that have like titles that are very different, but they're usually a reference to like a poem or an idea that has been translated in English differently, or is written in English differently than how it was translated in Portuguese. So rather than like loop it back around, the translator will go to the original poem, obviously.
Well, Midnight is Not in Everyone's Reach got a stellar review in the New York Times. So congratulations on that. That's
surprising and fantastic. He has been reviewed frequently. Like he's gotten so much praise, and yet and so for the New York Times to do it feels like appropriate and like something they should be doing. That's the kind of author they should be paying attention to under any guise, and especially even at this period in time. And yet at the same time, like, he feels so far under the radar to me. And it may just be that like there was like a lot of authors, there's a peak moment in like the late 90s. There's a peak moment like in the early like 10, 15 years later, and then 10, 15 years later again, people are rediscovering him, and that there's been kind of like lulls in between with like
Yeah.
Yale bringing out some, Dalkey doing some. It's like kind of split. But then like with Midnight, that seemed to land. And I had a really strong feeling in editing that was going to be the book that would like help get him back into prominence. And I think that's, I mean, this isn't going to be any sort of big like illuminative statement, but the fact that it's not super central around the Angola War with Portugal makes a huge difference. There's a lot more to grab onto. Your grounding is very explicit. It's 3 days. The chat that's delineated as such in the parts. There's the 10 chapters per each part. The last one's being in a different voice. It's all simple. You know where you are. It's a woman visiting her old, like where she went in the summers. She wants to kill herself. She's remembering the time that her family was there. Lots of repetition like usual, lots of like mixing up of memories, and you get that vibe. That's all so much easier from a reader perspective than say Commission of Tears, or sorry, Warning to the Crocodiles, Commission of Tears as well. But those two that are much more Angola centric and involve like various factions that come out of like the war that's going on there. Like it's like the first time I read about like the Spanish Civil War where you're like, there's too many players here. I don't know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are and like where people like sit. And in Angola in particular, there's like fragments of like political views that come apart. People that you think are like, oh, I'm rooting for them essentially, they become bad in certain ways or acts, and it all gets so complex in terms of like where the like what the overall situation is, that I think those are like harder for a new reader to come into. But then the ones like what you said you went to Inquisitor's Manual, that's one that I find incredibly readable because it is more grounded in like in people's lives, not specifically in Angola. Not to dismiss the Angola ones, it's super important to his life and his career. And has like an impact that goes through all of the books. I just know that when it's those ones, they're really challenging. And this Midnight is so much cleaner in that way that I figured this could be a one that will really like hit people. And it seems to have done that, which is spectacular. Because there's also a great review in the Washington Post, and it's been very well received in comparison to some of the other recent ones.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't get that one. It was paywalled. But
I paid $1. I PayPal'd $1 to download. I'll send you the PDF. Bezos
okay,
does
great.
not need my dollar. I'm gonna steal your one review, buddy.
Um, I guess I can see what you're saying about this one. Midnight is not within everyone's reach is a bit easier, but as I was reading some of the other two titles that I had, I did notice that this one is even a bit more disjointed.
Oh yeah,
The subject matter, you're right, is pretty basic. It's a family story, right? And of
right.
course, the war does come into it because the narrator's got three brothers. There's the older brother, there's the not deaf brother, and then there's the deaf brother.
It took me so long to puzzle that out.
And the older brother has committed suicide years past. I think
40
it's
years
ostensibly
ago.
so he wouldn't have to go to war.
Yes.
Um, the not the deaf brother does get drafted and has to go to war and comes back messed up.
Yep.
And then the deaf brother is, the deaf brother, and it's his mantra where he's trying to do the tongue twister.
Yep.
Over and over again. She sells seashells by the seashore. It's like a mantra that keeps going. But the just like the interspersing of all those voices, and like, okay, now you're like looking out into the beach where your brother committed suicide. Now you're thinking back to, your dad hiding in the pantry and drinking. And now you're splicing to your affair with your coworker. It's it's kind of all over the place. And it was interesting because I read an interview of Antunes. I think it might have been in the millions somewhere,
Oh yeah.
but it seemed to be that that he said that he felt that his books did get more complicated
I agree.
as they progress. And the way that he put it is that he used to use a lot of metaphors, but he came to the conclusion that the book is the metaphor for life. So he was going to stop with the metaphors. So that's interesting.
Okay, yeah. So I completely agree with that and have like have had a theory about that for a while. That in terms of like the kind of book as metaphor, I like to think of it as like the book as consciousness, that the narratorial voice has gone from like trying to define individual characters that I mean there are individual characters, but instead of just focusing on characters in the way that you would think about them sort of realistically in which they are separate and distinct figures within like a larger plot that's being described as his career has continued. With the first book came out, I'm just looking at this in 79, and I should make a correction. I had mentioned South of Nowhere that did come out translated by Elizabeth Lowe in 1983, and then was retranslated as The Land at the End of the World, which is this one from Norton, not Knowledge of Hell. That was separate. And the retranslation of that was by Margaret Joel Costa. So, like you said, there's a ton of translators here: Clifford Landers, Richard Zenith, Gregor Rabassa, but Rhett McNeil as well. But the point that I was going to make is that I think that he starts out like relatively straightforward. Like Knowledge of Hell is like a guy in a bar kind of like complaining and telling his life story. It's like it's relatively like straight in terms of like literary fiction. You get it. There's several voices, but it's not all intermingled. And then as he goes on, he's one of those authors that keeps trying to find a new way to tell something. And in some ways, like this relates to the background of both him being in Angola as a psychiatrist and trying to look at like the cultural repercussions and for like cultural memory and for like the history of Portugal through the Angola War, that there's so much like repression and so much like people don't want to talk about it. Like when Salazar gets overthrown, like it's sort of like it's like not a topic that's processed, and that he keeps going back to it, going back to it, and going back to it. And in that process, it goes from being like, this was the experience to like this exploded experience where like the mind of any character in these later books includes all these other pieces from like other, not necessarily other characters from other books, but from their life is now more spread out. So his writing style shifts from like a singular kind of focused voice into something that's like the whole book is that voice. Some of them are similar. Like when you start reading like most of the other more recent ones, like Crocodiles or Commission of Tears, you're like, this is the same style as Midnight. And that's true. Like it looks the same on the page. He's gotten to a point where like that's kind of his bit, his like way of representing stuff. But at the same time, they are very different in terms of like where the focus is and where the voices come from and how they come in. So like in this one, there are like when she's 11 and 52, I guess, like those ages are the kind of primary markers. In Commission of Tears, if I remember right, it's sort of like a girl who's like very young and then like in her teens and then later. Like I forget if it's that book, but there's one where there's like a few different spots where it's like kind of focused in on, and those all intermingle, and they create their own voice and their own style as they go along. But it is something that I think like he's evolved over time. Looking at these like in terms of the order of publication, like Act of the Damned was one that I see as very like straightforward, quote unquote, because it's got like two parts. First part has like one singular voice of the doctor, then it goes to like this outside country and a family. That's from 1985. So between then and like the books that the Midnight came out in 2012, that's a significant amount of time to like develop and cultivate your look at like how you're going to express yourself and how you're going to capture it. But I agree with you. Like the metaphor thing works. I think of it as like a consciousness sort of idea.
Yeah, that's really interesting, really helpful. I guess, the two other titles that I've looked at, the Splendor of Portugal and the Inquisitor's Manual. Splendor of Portugal was 97. Inquisitor's Manual was 96 in the original.
There you go.
And they're very polyvocal, but there are sections breaks really when you're getting to a different voice. Like the Inquisitor's know, is the chapters are these reports. And so you've got first report, second report, and you've got the narrator reporting, but then you'll have another person doing commentary within that first report.
Yes.
And then with the Splendor of Portugal, it's going between two different time frames. It's Christmas Eve, 1995 in Portugal, and then it's like late 70s, early 80s in Angola. And there's chapter breaks, section breaks. So you are hearing a lot of different voices, but it's not kind of these braided voices all on like one page that you're kind of sometimes getting a little bit of a whiplash. When I first started reading it, I think I compared it to Virginia Woolf's The Waves a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah. I think that's very true. Especially in this book. I think that's true of a lot of his books, but there is with Midnight in particular this sense of that there are certain images that keep recurring. That there's like kind of like in The Waves, you sort of hone in on like these like particular images. The bike is one of them. Obviously like the drowning, like there's certain things that just the father going in to get the alcohol, that kind of thing that keeps coming back and keeps coming back. And because it's like that repetitive system, sort of like The Waves does, but then also like this myriad voices, I feel like it's reading it's a weird experience where you see like a lot of things all at once and can hone in on that specific repeated passage and end up with more of a tone or a vibe to the book than necessarily like a plotted X happened, then Y happened, then Z happened. Instead, those, to go back to your term, to go back to metaphor, like those metaphors are those like symbols, those motifs come to have such, they take on such momentous power as the book goes along through that repetition and through the return to them, that they transcend the like moment in which you learn about them to be like part of the whole thread of the book. I mean, I guess it would be like, put this in like real like academic-y terms, like the Deleuze and Guattari Thousand Plateaus book and the rhizomatic nature of books. His books fit that theory so well that rather than like a sort of like climax and denouement and following things in a certain line, the books have like a bunch of different like threads or ideas that like wrap around each other under the surface and create like kind of a pattern that from the top level isn't always necessarily obvious, but also doesn't follow what we're expecting of like a rising action and like something that's completely linear, but isn't said very spatial. And in a way, like I've always grouped him too with like Sebald for that, where it's like this landscape of memory idea where like it's not just like what you remember, but where you remember it and the spaces in which you remember it and what becomes close to each other. Like it could be like an event in Angola and then an event later on in this person's life. Those get kind of mashed together in memory. So in memory, they're next to each other, but in space and time, they're truly not. And I think that the way that he works within these is both fascinating and like really like you have to be on your toes, but also like expect not to understand each sentence or who's saying it, but to instead focus on that, like let the vibe take you. Let the sort of feeling win instead of like the trying to make it all rational.
And I guess from my perspective, the repetition is helpful. I mean, I can see it from an aesthetic standpoint, why he's doing it and the way that the structure of the novel works, but or just his writing in general from the three that I've read. But maybe I'm just like very amenable now to repetition after spending so much time with Miss Macintosh, My Darling by Marguerite Young, which is like the pinnacle of repetition, right? For 1,300 pages. So there's that too. One of the things that I read preparing for this was an interview, I think in the White Review, of Margaret Jewel Costa, and talking about her experience translating him. Ooh. And she talked about the fact that in Portuguese there aren't so many distinctions with verb tenses and past and present, and so which to me sounds like a nightmare for a translator, okay? Because you're dealing with this language where it's kind of more fluid, which which works really well for the kind of writing he's doing. But then if you have to try to bring it to an English speaking audience, I feel like it would be very challenging.
Yeah, or I mean, very challenging, but also it could be sort of relieving if you lean into like that idea that what overrides these books is that memory is always now. That a lot of these people are living those moments in like a now. So like trying to separate the past and the present, we do that as markers. And like one of the I have it open, but and I could like verify this, but in going through and giving suggestions to Elizabeth, that was usually where I was at is like this is too confusing. Like we need some separation either by like the tense of it or like something that like gets you back on the rails. Because like my major thing was like just trying to make sure that like if you focused in on it as a reader, you wouldn't feel like you were like it was inaccessible as to like where you were, what was happening. And as long as you can keep that on the rails, anything goes. But like from the perspective of like an investigation of trauma and its impact on memory, the fact that everything's happening kind of simultaneously, like almost tenseless in a sense, makes a good degree of like, I mean, that's logical in a way. That is kind of how people function. We like overlay ideas from the past that have especially traumatic ones on top of what we're seeing now and create like that kind of third memory in which these things are connected, even if they're not necessarily connected. Like this might be getting off into like a weird not woo-woo version of like spiritual memory, but like that kind, like the way that we relive traumas and recreate these patterns is always occurring in his books. And it's because you can't see what's now versus what's then. What's then is living in you now. Like you can't get rid of, if you've been to Angola and seen some of those horrors of like truly like reprehensible, like murders and hangings and all the kind of like awful aspects of a war like that. And even if it, like in his situation, trying to treat people who were fighting, even though I don't think he was actively fighting, he was on like the medical side of things, like that memory doesn't leave. And I think anytime like something gets close to triggering it, that memory is there alongside what's happening. So with the verb tenses being like fewer in Portuguese or like not as like specifically denoted, almost more like a kind of like the simultaneity or the like everything happening all at once. I think that really like lends itself to his aesthetic project in a way that like I wouldn't be surprised. And I've not read as many interviews, especially not recently. Back when, sure, but like it's been a lot of years that have passed. But I could see him reflecting on that in terms of like how he's trying to make his next book, what he's going to do for his next book is playing with that idea of like, oh, you know, if I don't use this or if I use this sort of tense, then I can better explain or better capture this idea of the how the mind works, which really seems to be his project. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, like, you know, I think he's like not doing super well. So I don't know how many more new books he'll be writing in Portuguese. Like we may be running out of those and just filling in the ones that haven't been translated, getting those out into English. And that, you know, that could be it. But to be able to see that project from beginning to end is really truly amazing.
Yeah.
As one way to like approach him.
He's super prolific, and although I made the comment that wow, it's been a lot of translators. I mean, yeah, it's been a lot of translators, but it's a whole lot of books as well. And in one of the interviews, he talked about his like his process, and it was like, you know, he writes for 11 hours a day, like, you
Jesus.
know, 9 to 8, and he takes 2-hour breaks, and it's like every day. And he also said that he never reads any of his work. It's like when he submits it to the publisher, he's done with it. He never reads any of his translations, so he doesn't really know, like, are they good translations or not.
I
Sometimes
love
he
it.
talks to the translator, although it seemed that Margaret Jewel Costa didn't really have a lot of interaction with him. But
Yeah.
getting to your thesis about like his project is like how the mind works. Another thing that he said that I thought was really interesting, in addition to that the book itself is a metaphor for life, is that imagination is really nothing more than memory.
Oh, wow.
So I think, and that ties in very well with what you were saying, that
Yeah.
it's not necessarily like for each of these books he's like coming up with like, a snappy plot or something like that. It's like just these memories of these characters that have to be based in some respect with his own memories, like being in the war in Angola. And then, that's kind of how his imagination manifests itself, but it's all, the core is the memory.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's very true. And that's a really good way to put it. Like that, like imagination becoming like kind of I was going to say imagining, but the remembering of those memories alters them in some way. And that's kind of where the imagination comes in. Like what changed or what is changing. And that's one of the things I always try and pay attention to in his books, but it's hard to like really parse is like how when these characters like when she's reflecting on the same sort of things over and over and over again and telling those same little anecdotes over and over and over again, how from page 1 to page 570 did that story change? And like how often when it's retold is it slightly different? How much do those differences like indicate about the character? It's such a hard thing to like process in the moment of like reading it, in the moment of editing it. It's more of like up to like an academic to like really pull that apart and to look at like one of the books even and just say like, here's something that's really interesting about that development, very specifically in like a word choice or in like a shifting. I would be fascinated by someone to do a study like someone who's much smarter and more capable of using like search functions than I am to like figure that out or write something very cool about it. That would be great.
Yeah, that would be. I mean, there's definitely, like you spoke before, like certain totems that, like, it does seem pretty much like the exact same phrasing. Like in the Splendor of Portugal, one of my favorite characters is the cook who Carlos loves, and she's got like a crazy name. But every time he mentions her, um, and she's apparently the only person that he um, that he liked when he was a little boy. But every time she's mentioned, it's that she like smoked a cigarette backwards, like with the
Oh,
ashes like in her mouth.
goddamn
Uh,
disgusting. If you're ever a smoker and you light the wrong end, it's the worst experience you can have.
you can tell I'm not a smoker because I didn't even know how to say it. Yeah, her name is Maria de Boa Morte. So
Okay.
that's like such a cool name. But yeah, and she's always smoking from the wrong end of the cigarette. So it would
I
be.
don't smoke anymore, just to make that clear, but I did in college, and I remember drunkenly lighting the wrong end and being like, I don't know what to do now.
I tried it, like, I think one time to just like try to look cool, and I looked like a total idiot. So then I just gave up. Um, so yeah, I don't know what you think. I do think there's a strong case if readers are wanting to know, like, oh, where do I start with this author? And you should absolutely read this author. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me at all if he won the Nobel Prize. It seems like it's way overdue.
Wouldn't either. This could be a very interesting Nobel Prize season, I think, or could be.
Yeah. So midnight is not in everyone's reach. You're right. The subject matter is something that we can all relate to.
Yeah.
Um, but there is that issue about how braided the voices are and not kind of set off in different sections. So I guess of the three that I've read so far, I found The Splendor of Portugal, which is also a Dalkey title, to
Yes.
be the most approachable.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I can see that for sure, for sure. And this is also earlier, like you said, 97.
Yeah. And he does something kind of interesting in this one that I didn't see in the other two. He uses a lot of parentheses.
Oh yeah,
Um,
that isn't very common in my memory either.
yeah. So, um, but yeah, what a fascinating author. And I'm a huge Saramago fan, and I'm also a great fan of another Portuguese author, Essa Caroche.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I've read some of his books, but it's been some time now.
The Maiaeus is my
Yep.
absolute favorite.
That's
And you know
that's what I
what
was
book
thinking of.
you know what that reminds me of a lot is your open letter book, The Chronicle of the Murdered
I was
House.
thinking the same thing. Yep. Yep. I read
Those
those around
two,
the same time, I think, too.
those are both like huge, huge books, and they both have this like gothic atmosphere and just like a family that's gone bonkers, basically.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%. I love
Yeah.
that book too. I love him too. Yeah, all three of them are fantastic. I haven't read Saramago in a long time. I know there's some books that came out after I read everything, and then I sort of had fallen off. But I really liked him, and I do still like him. But once I hit Antunes, I think I just chose that camp and kept leaning into
Yeah.
like, oh, this is so much my thing. Like this is like all of my other authors, and Saramago is to a degree as well. But he's a little different. He's a little bit like the structure is also complicated, and his way of like having the single paragraph sort of thing is kind of a complicated maneuver, but not really. It's all very like telling you what's happening in a way that you can suss out without a ton of mental work. Whereas I felt like Antunes was like basically like figure this out on your own. Like you're not going to
Yeah.
be able to just like passively read this at the beach without feeling frustrated. Like you're going to have to lock in. And those kind of books like Hopscotch, that era of like the very active reader, having to put those pieces together is always so compelling to me. Even though as I get older, I'm like, I don't know that I have the stamina for this or like the willpower. It's still a thing that always like pulls me in. And at that point in time, when I was first reading these 25 years ago, I was like, this is so much. Like this is like exactly what I want literature to look like. And I know that it's not popular, even though to me it feels like this is so rewarding. It just takes a little extra effort.
Yeah.
Now I'm
Yeah.
like,
So
hard.
before I let you go, is there a time frame for your next Dalkey title by him?
Due. I think it's due. I think that she's supposed to turn it in within the next 3 months. So by the end of the
Okay.
year, if I remember right. It would take me a little bit to like look through all the files to see if anything's there, but I don't believe that it's been turned in yet, and that she was still working on like the final version. So which would mean that it would probably come out in like the spring of 27. So like about 14, 16 months later than when the translation is turned in. But I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's another I haven't looked into it too carefully, but I think it's another one of these like 400, 500 page books, another big one, which I do like, even though it would be fun to like work on a short one. That would be like the overwhelmingness of like that file and like getting into it is really rewarding in a way. I was going to say, when you're talking about the books to read first, I think the ones you recommended are great. The other option is if you use any one of those, Splendor, Portugal, or Midnight, one of the kind of like later ones, and contrast it with Knowledge of Hell. Knowledge of Hell is a really good template because it is like one voice of a guy telling about his experiences related to Angola, kind of mirroring Antunes's life and sort of setting up his sort of project going forward. So it's like kind of a seed of things versus like the fully realized, not that this book isn't fully realized, but the fully realized explosion of that comes up in Midnight and some of these later ones. So it would be a good like kind of compare and contrast where if you start Midnight and you're like, whoa, this is a lot, and went to Knowledge, you'd probably then be able to go back to Midnight with like enough like kind of awareness of what his techniques are to make it work. The other one that I highly recommend, but is like truly daunting, is Fatal Alexandrino. This is like his biggest book, I believe, in terms of word count. It's giant, and it's the only one that's truly typeset with like a very tight margin and tight leading. Like it's bigger than all the others in terms of size, but it's also like got the most words. This one is truly epic and is absolutely amazing, but requires a lot of time and a lot of effort. Like this is probably the most challenging, but also one of the more rewarding ones once you get deep into it.
And what was the title again?
I think I'm probably mispronouncing, but Fatal Alexandrino.
Okay. Is that a guy's name?
No, it's like a type of the Fado is the songs, but then I don't believe that it's
Oh,
a
okay.
where it's the it's a reference to like the kind of structure sound of it. But it's got the 3 parts, which are before the revolution, and after the revolution. All that's like catnip for me. That's
Yeah, yeah,
really
yeah.
like sad. Like,
And that's a Grove title.
it's a Grove title, yeah, and it's an older one as well, but it's one that like has always been if he wins the Nobel Prize, this will be referenced as one of like the big books that helped him win the Nobel Prize. It's on that level, so it's another one to check out.
I always get starry-eyed when you tell me like this is the longest work this author's ever done. I'm like, I'm going for that one.
This one's
It's a sickness. It's a sickness.
Like, I don't even know. I'm going to look because I don't think it's that many pages. No, it's 496 pages, but it's tight. And I remember giving my students a few pages of this to introduce them to like styles of writing, and they were so confused and so not into it at all. Which I don't know. That's a good thing. Got to spread your wings. Change your horizon.
Keep them on their toes.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Chad. Well, it was wonderful talking to you today about this book, and I hope that folks go out and check out "Midnight Is Not in Everyone's Reach" by António Lobo Antunes, and translated by the great Elizabeth Lowe. She does great work, and she's been at it for a while.
Yes, I believe she retired from the University of Illinois a couple of years ago, maybe more than a couple at this point, but now she can focus on not having to teach and also not having to do administrative duties and just translating really, really incredible books. So I think that's wonderful.
All right. Take care.
You too.